What is Western civilization? This is the question everyone has been asking of late. It all began back in 2016 with a dispute over pronouns. One Canadian lobster enthusiast, Jordan Peterson, stood up and said, "I will not say your pronouns because I believe in the power of the word, the power of Logos, the power of Jesus Christ." Jordan Peterson exploded onto the scene, sending a shockwave through the consciousness of every young Western man. I still remember him pacing back and forth on the stage, in the dark, the harsh lights glaring down, casting long shadows on his face, his brow furrowed in thought. Like many young men, Jordan Peterson introduced me to the world of quote-unquote Western civilization. When I was growing up, I always felt that we were living in a kind of post-historic age. It seemed like, overall in the world, everything was okay. Yes, there were terrible things happening, different places, wars, famines, terrorist organizations, cartels, but for the most part we had climbed out of the trenches of history and everything was okay. The world was as it seemed. Most people lived relatively happy lives, at least compared to what they would have lived like 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. We had put all primitive impulses and belief systems behind us. Every week there was a new scientific invention. Probably soon we would invent immortality or something like that. And yet, I was deeply unsatisfied. I felt that this world that we had created was a wholly artificial world. And by creating this fake reality, we had robbed life of all meaning. I believed that the meaning of life came in the raw, primal interactions, brotherhood and love, hunting, survival, all these things that we no longer needed to do. I felt that we lived removed from nature, removed from the realities of life. I fantasized about the American frontier and about the post-apocalyptic world of The Walking Dead. As all young men do, I longed for adventure. I longed for struggle. I read these fantasy books, watched these movies, these grand battles between good and evil, and I'd come back to my mundane life in school and think, this is all so meaningless. If only I had some great struggle I could engage in. Yes, I could join the military and go off to fight some war in some foreign country, in some struggle that I really have no stakes in, but that didn't really seem appealing. I wanted something that I really believed in, that I could really devote myself to. I longed for something worth fighting for. And Jordan Peterson provided that thing, Western civilization. He said, maybe everything isn't all hunky-dory. Maybe things aren't quite as good as they seem. Maybe we are headed towards disaster because we are denying reality, because we have strayed from tradition. Maybe it is our task to save Western civilization. And that grabbed my attention, that ignited my imagination. Western civilization, what is this thing? I thought that in modernity I had been robbed of any sense of identity, of tribe, of tradition, of glory, of heroism, but here I was being told that I was the inheritor of the greatest civilization to ever exist, and that it was my task to defend it. And so I became a Western civilization enthusiast. But what exactly is this thing, Western civilization, and why is it worth saving? Well, Jordan Peterson explained that Western civilization was essentially Christianity, and that it was worth saving because it was civilization itself. Christianity and the surrounding Western traditions which had sprung out of it and fed into it provided stability. They were the very bedrock of civilization, and without them, civilization will collapse. So I began to read the Bible, I began to study Christianity, and I thought, okay, maybe I can get behind this. It seems a little distant, a little strange, a little far away, set off in the desert, but maybe I can get behind this. As a child, I had always loved the Greeks, the Romans, the knights, tales of heroism, and I identified deeply with these stories. But now I saw them as more than just stories. I saw them as relics of the civilization of my ancestors. I saw them as my inheritance. I went off to college and I began to study ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And bit by bit, I began to question Jordan Peterson's narrative about quote-unquote Western civilization. As I studied these ancient peoples, these ancient cultures, I began to see that the West was not built by some kind of ideology. It was clearly built by the peoples and cultures which created Europe. The peoples who lived in Europe, who built massive buildings and statues to their gods. It was built by them and what they believed. That is what shaped and created Western civilization. Sure, Christianity played a part as it was imported and filtered through the belief systems, the eyes of these different peoples, shaped to their wills, but that was by no means the body and the blood of the West. And I began to think, this is a little strange. Jordan Peterson will occasionally mention Socrates or Plato. Occasionally he'll give reference to English common law, but he never really mentions the foundational texts, values, beliefs, religions of Greek civilization, Roman civilization, the Germanic tribes, the Norse in their glorious Viking age, or even the chivalric, heroic values of medieval Europe. He rooted his understanding of the West entirely in the Bible, a text written in the East and in Christianity, an ideology which came to the West relatively late. The Romans didn't convert until 380, and then they fell in 476. The Norse weren't even fully converted till the year 1000. So are we to ignore everything before that, everything besides Christianity? That doesn't make any sense. That's definitely not a holistic view of Western civilization or the Western spirit. And so as I studied, I slowly began to uncover the true story of the West, the true history of the West, and I found that it was far more glorious, far more appealing than anything Jordan Peterson had ever presented to me. In what he said, I saw glimmers of what I longed for, but here I had found the real thing. To actually understand the West, we have to go back to the very beginning. From around 4,000 or 5,000 BC to around 1000 BC, the Indo-Europeans, a nomadic, horse-riding, warrior steppe people, you've probably heard of them, drinking milk, riding their horses, bringing their gods, the Skyfather, the Thunderer, Thor, rode in waves from the steppe into Europe. This was a very tumultuous period in Europe as they mixed with, probably in many cases conquered, and eventually integrated with the locals, the farming populations who already lived in Europe. Of course, there was civilization, there was religion for thousands of years in Europe before this, but as far as history goes, as far as our records go, as far as we can conjecture, this really is the beginning of Europe as we know it. The Indo-Europeans brought with them their language, which would then branch off into all the languages that we know. Of course, there was civilization in Europe for thousands of years before this, but as far as we can see into history, this is really where Europe as we know it was born. The Indo-Europeans brought with them their language, which then split off into all the European languages that we know today, and they brought with them their religion, which, combined probably to some degree with the local religion, branched off into all the religions of the European peoples. Hellenic paganism, Roman paganism, Norse paganism, Celtic paganism, all came from the original religion of the Indo-Europeans, of course mixed with other things, with other influences, but it is at this time in history that we can first identify a cultural, linguistic, and genetic Europe fairly close to how we know it today. With a few exceptions, all Europeans today speak an Indo-European derived language. All Europeans are a mix of the farmers who are in Europe and the steppe peoples genetically, and all ancient European cultures shared the same basic heroic values and worldview rooted in their religions. This will tell you far more about the character of European civilization, about what the West is essentially, than what the Israelites were up to at this time, off in Egypt or Babylon somewhere. Yet Jordan Peterson doesn't mention the Indo-Europeans even once, as far as I'm aware. And if he does, he certainly doesn't emphasize them. You might think I'm dogging on good old Jordan Peterson a little bit too much. After all, he's just a friendly old man who I think has good intentions. But I'm using him as a proxy. I'm using him to represent a certain worldview that we have been fed, a certain conception of Western civilization that we have been fed, which is now beginning to crumble, which people are now beginning to see through. Okay, so what happens after the Indo-Europeans have established themselves? There were various thriving cultures all across Europe. There was the expansive Celtic culture with trade networks all across Europe. But we don't have written records from these times. So people will often say Western civilization began with the Greeks, because we have lots of records from the Greeks. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were written down somewhere around 800 or 700 BC, and they would have existed long before that because they're an oral tradition. It would have evolved, it would have been passed down, who knows how long, but probably based on events which would have taken place maybe 1200 BC. And in these texts, we have a record of their worldview and of their theology. And I'm not going to go into depth and explain what that is because I've talked about that at length in other videos. But right here, we already have the European equivalent of the Bible in these two texts. And these texts are extremely advanced in a literary sense. Not only do they contain within them these highly nuanced, so nuanced you might even miss them, explanations about their theological and moral worldview, but the style, from the technical part, the meter in which it was written, to the descriptions and the realism of the dialogue, is extremely impressive, extremely vivid. It's definitely a better literary work in terms of the actual quality of the literature than the Bible. Again, Jordan Peterson does not really talk about the Iliad or the Odyssey as far as I know. I'm sure he's mentioned them at some point, but there's so much in here. Just reading these books in detail, as I've been doing over on my Substack, you might want to check it out, will reveal so much about Western civilization. It's actually shocking and mind-blowing. Every time I read them, I find even more. Alright, so we got to pick up the pace a little bit here if we're going to get through this video in under an hour. So the Greeks do their thing. Eventually they do become kind of decadent, as all civilizations do when they gain great power and wealth. They have these other philosophies later, Plato and Socrates and all this stuff, and they begin to stray a bit from the traditional religion of their ancestors, the heroic, Homeric worldview. Socrates is like, I don't know about that guy Homer, that stuff is kind of a corrupting influence on the youth. But the next rising European power is the Romans. Now, the Romans had their own unique branch of European paganism, which, since it came from the same root, already shared similarities with the Greeks. For example, they worshipped Jupiter, the same god as Zeus, originally coming from Deus Pater. And then you have Zeus Pater and Eu Pater, the sky father, the daylight father. So they shared, again, the same basic moral and religious framework, the same chief god, but the Romans had their own gods, and the Greeks had their own gods. The Greeks probably got some of their gods from the east. But as the Romans came to power, they began to Hellenize themselves. They began to adopt the culture of the Greeks because it had authority, it had antiquity. The Greeks had been the great power before them, and the Romans wanted to inherit that authority and inherit their wonderful culture, their poetry, their myth, their philosophy. And the Romans, of course, took over the known world at the time. And right when they transitioned from a republic to an empire, the poet Virgil wrote the Aeneid, which essentially worked to tie Roman civilization into the Greek epic cycle, so that after the fall of Troy, Aeneas flees to Rome, and the Trojans mix with the Latins, and they birth the Romans. So he basically tied in poetry, in myth, Roman civilization to Greek civilization, setting up the Romans as the successors to the Greeks, as the inheritors of the Mediterranean. Now, this is extremely important for understanding what Western civilization is, quote-unquote Western civilization, because here we have, for the first time, the idea that one European civilization, the Romans, is inheriting the legacy and culture of another European civilization or peoples, the Greeks, and that these two civilizations have continuity, that one feeds into another. And this really is the basis for the idea of Western civilization. That is not just European civilization, as in the various peoples and cultures, but as in one civilization which links together many different successive civilizations and cultures into one grand civilizational project. So the Romans become decadent, like all peoples who gain power and wealth. They began drinking a little bit too much, partying a little bit too much. They stopped believing in the old gods. They stop upholding their customs and morals. They become a little loose. Different religions become popular, different Eastern religions, and eventually Christianity begins to become popular, and in 380 it becomes the official religion of Rome. In 476, less than 100 years later, Rome officially falls in the West. It officially falls to the barbarians. Now, by this time, some of the Germanic tribes had already converted to a form of Christianity, Arianism with an I, not with a Y, just as the Romans had begun to adopt Hellenic culture because of its power, its authority. The Germanic tribes, impressed with the power and the culture of the Romans, began to adopt some of their culture. And when they took over Rome, the territory of Western Rome, they didn't just eviscerate Roman civilization, they didn't burn Rome to the ground. They attempted to continue Roman civilization in their own way. They inherited and continued, reshaped Roman civilization by adopting its institutions, its culture, and its religions. Of course, they didn't completely abandon their roots either, but they became Romanized, just as the Greeks had become Hellenized. Now, Byzantine Rome had continued in the East, and I don't count that as an unbroken continuation of Rome. Really, that was its own civilization. When Western Rome fell, but the Byzantine Empire did continue the Roman tradition, but it branched off in a different direction. And the reason why I don't talk about it much is because it's not part of this chain of Western civilization. It went off in a different direction, and therefore did not become inherited by the other European cultures. In the West, the Franks converted to Christianity, and Charlemagne crowned himself emperor of the Romans. They now practiced the Roman religion and upheld Roman institutions. And they even began to see themselves as Trojans, tying themselves into the Trojan War, the beginning of the Greek epic cycle, just as the Romans had. This was used as a justification for the sack of Constantinople, Trojan vengeance against the Greeks. After Charlemagne's Carolingian dynasty came the Holy Roman Empire, run by the Germanic tribes, again continuing the Roman tradition, as you see in the name. So I think you can see by now where I'm going with all of this. Christianity in the Bible absolutely influenced Europe, influenced the trajectory of Western civilization, but people will say that Christianity created Europe, the idea of a unified Europe. But clearly you can see that that's not really true here. And while there were different theories tracing European tribes back to the Bible, back to the sons of Noah or the lost tribes of Israel, primarily they saw themselves as inheritors of the tradition of the Romans, and the Romans who had inherited the tradition of the Greeks. They saw their origin in the Trojan War. Now, while all of this was going on, the Vikings in the north were still pagan. They had a thriving pagan civilization, and during the Dark Ages, they actually held a great advantage over the European mainland. They're often depicted in movies as savage, dirty barbarians, but that wasn't the case at all. They had a rich literary tradition like the Greeks. They had laws. You could even get divorces. They had a thriving, wealthy civilization, and for this reason, they could go in and sack mainland Europe, threaten their kings, extort great amounts of money from them, all without reprisal. Now, the big problem in Scandinavia is there's not enough farmland. This is why they would raid. And so they began to settle down in mainland Europe. And this made raiding harder because now you have Vikings who had settled down in the mainland, like the Normans, defending the mainland. And as mainland Europe began to recover from the Dark Ages, they slowly gained the advantage, and it became advantageous for Norse kings to convert to Christianity so that they could inherit Roman institutions, especially divine monarchy. Imagine you're a Viking king. You can only really maintain power if people agree that you're a good king. Of course, you'll have claim to divine lineage, and you will have received the throne in some sort of authoritative way, either through ancestry or through conquest. But there's nothing stopping your men from overthrowing you or another Viking leader saying, "You are a bad king, I'm going to kill you, and I will be king." But if you convert to Christianity, you get to form an alliance with mainland Europe, you get to trade with them, and you become a divinely mandated monarchy. You get to inherit the institutions of Rome and of the church, and this whole apparatus of church and state to govern with. And you end up in a lot better of a position. And that's what began to happen. This is why with the Norse, you see that the kings would always convert first, sometimes superficially, they just get baptized but continued practicing their old religion. And even when they did convert apparently sincerely, their peoples would continue practicing the old religion for generations afterwards. By around 1000 AD, despite their reluctance, all of the Norse had converted, at least officially, to Christianity. But since this conversion was less total, since it took longer, it was more mixed, it didn't always stick, and both the ancient religion and the new religion often would exist alongside of each other, that meant that a large portion of Norse culture, and by proxy Germanic culture, since the Germans and the English as well shared the same culture, shared the same gods, was preserved. So now we have another great shaping influence on European culture. Again, something else that Jordan Peterson almost never talks about. And what is most shocking, surprising, delightful of all is that if you read the Norse sagas, you will find an almost identical worldview as that contained within Homer. The Norse sagas were all written down around 800 to 1000 AD, based on traditions which went back a lot longer than that, while the Homeric traditions were written down between 800 and 1000 BC. And these texts came from cultures on the opposite ends of Europe, and probably from the two peoples of Europe who are the most genetically distant, geographically distant, and in this case temporally distant, yet we see the same worldview intact. And that basically confirms for us that there was this pan-European religious culture, which really is the backbone of Europe. Now, around this time, something interesting was happening, what I call the chivalric revolution. There was this new literary tradition emerging, the stories of King Arthur. Now, the earliest Arthurian texts depict Arthur as the descendant of Brutus, the grandson of Aeneas, who himself traveled from Troy, the main character in the Aeneid. So still we have this link to Rome. And around 1100 AD, again not long after the Norse had converted, along comes this writer, Chrétien de Troyes. And he writes these heroic romances based on Welsh pagan mythology, and they're full of pagan themes, both in terms of the magical creatures, the mystical otherworld, dwarves and giants and strange occurrences, in terms of the characters, and in terms of the actual values showed in the text. In these texts, we see almost the exact same values which we see in the earlier pagan Irish literature, and even those which we see in Homer, of course with a slightly different emphasis due to the effect of Christianity and the distance of the cultures, but essentially we see the same worldview. And Chrétien in his works posits something that's a little bit subversive for the time, the idea that glory and excellence are the highest goods, alongside love, which remains good even if it is extramarital. This, of course, goes against church doctrines. And we know that he was translating classical works, he was highly influenced by the classics, and highly influenced by Welsh mythology. And his works formed the foundation of romance and chivalry as we know it. So what was going on here? This was basically a mini Renaissance, or a precursor to the Renaissance, where this new emerging culture, chivalry, which was based on classical and pagan values of heroism, of love, was really dethroning Christianity as the dominant moral paradigm. And yes, chivalry was influenced by Christianity, but it also in many ways was heavily anti-Christian. We know this because the authors who took up Chrétien's material in the later Grail cycle condemned Lancelot for seeking glory above God and for having an affair, an extramarital affair, with Guinevere. They condemned him as a sinner and placed Galahad, his son, who is a virgin who seeks only grace, humility, charity, and chastity, the glory of God, as his successor. What is the story of Galahad? He doesn't care about women, he doesn't care about glory, he doesn't care about heroism. He is chaste, he is humble, he seeks out the Grail. The Grail, of course, is a symbol of Christ, and when he finds it, he achieves divine ecstasy and dies on the spot, going to heaven. Meanwhile, Lancelot and Guinevere's love affair causes the downfall of Arthur's kingdom, and Arthur is killed, and Lancelot and Guinevere both become chaste, and they become repentant hermits. Okay, this is a very different story from the original material. And here we have, in very plain terms, Christian authors telling us that the original romances were not Christian. They were pagan. Okay, so what am I yapping on about? What is the point of this? My point is that we are now seeing the Christian worldview, which has been injected into Europe, come into Europe, conflicting with the original, more ancient, pan-European heroic worldview. And of course, these two worldviews came into conflict when Christianity was first spreading through Europe. But now, after Europe has already been converted in places like France and Germany, where Christianity had already been around for quite a while, we see that the pagan spirit, the heroic spirit, has not disappeared and is in fact re-emerging, attempting to dethrone the Christian moral paradigm. And you're having this moral, spiritual, and religious struggle within this body of literature, which formed the basis of late medieval culture, just as the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid had for the Greeks and Romans. And you could say, okay, well, maybe this was just the last throes of paganism, but finally it was Christianized. And yet, in the later English death of Arthur, what do we see? When Arthur dies, the author says, and there ended the line of Brutus, going all the way back to the Romans, all the way back to the Trojans. And with Arthur, with his death, and symbolically the death then of classical civilization and the classical inheritance, the age of heroes dies, and England falls into darkness, chaos, and disrepair, just like at the end of Beowulf, the last of the line of the Norse heroes. What we get is the image of a fallen world, a fallen Europe consumed by darkness, with its ancient, heroic, aristocratic lines eclipsed. A world in need of a renaissance, of a rebirth of heroism, of the pagan spirit, of Europe's classical inheritance. And in the Renaissance, which began while many of these Arthurian texts were still being written, we got just that, a rebirth of classical culture. Now, I'm not going to keep on yapping any longer, but I think suffice it to say that the history of Europe since then has been a struggle between these two spirits. That is fundamentally what we saw in the Renaissance, in the Enlightenment, in the Reformation, in Romanticism, in the struggle of nationalism and national, tribal, pagan identity against monarchy. In 1,000 different ways, and not necessarily clean ways, but very messy ways, these two spirits have continued to struggle. So now again we come to the question which Jordan Peterson first presented before me. What is Western civilization? For me, Western civilization is not an abstract identity, a superficial ideology. It is not Christianity. The West is based on something much more ancient and concrete, shared mythic, historical, and kinship ties across Europe, a shared civilizational project passing from one civilization to the next, lasting more than 3,000 years. If I were to have to explain the spirit of Europe to someone, I would not give them the Bible. I would not even give them Plato or Socrates. I would give them Homer. I would give them Virgil. I would give them the Arthurian romances, Beowulf, the Norse saga of the Volsungs. For it is through these that they would become acquainted with the spirit of Europe, with the heart of European civilization and the European soul. This is why I created my heroic literature course. Again, go check it out on Substack. But it's not just a course. In creating the course, I've also linked all of these texts together into one coherent narrative, one heroic story, one heroic history of Europe, a heroic canon in which we can base our beliefs and our values. If the West is just an abstraction, if the West is just freedom, democracy, Judeo-Christian values, then I have no attachment to it. Then I say it is not worth saving, let it burn. But that is not the case. In the Aeneid, I read about the struggles of my ancestors, the inheritance which they have passed to me. I read about what they believed and what they fought for, and I see that, in abandoning the inheritance of our fathers, we have committed the greatest crime there is. Yes, modern life may seem superficial, meaningless, unbearably mundane, but that is only because we don't see what is right before our eyes. We are the inheritors of an ancient tradition, of a 3,000-year civilizational project, something out of the greatest fantasy book, something out of Dune, and it is our task to revive, to restore, to reshape, and to continue that tradition. The words and deeds of our ancestors call out to us, immortalized forever in ink. When we read these texts, we open the tomb of our fathers and find their treasures still untouched, just as they were buried 1,000 years ago. There lie the bones of our ancestors and their weapons still sharp and glittering, with which we might arm ourselves against our foes and win back our glory.
If you're interested in learning about the worldview of the ancient pagan cultures of Europe, the ARC's Heroic Literature course is linked in the description. Thank you for your support.